Hello and welcome to Talking Automotive with Mark and John. My name's John Sinclair. Today we're talking to David Jenkins, the Managing Director of AutoTest. AutoTest produces a range of measuring equipment, and we're going to be talking to David about the regulatory bodies, legislation, what's happening in the market. It's a very interesting discussion, so let's jump into it. Remember, if you like what you hear, subscribe to our channel on YouTube below. You can also find us on Spotify and iTunes and other podcatchers. We also have our own website, autocurrents.com.
With 30 years' experience in auto logistics and state-of-the-art locations in 5 major Australian cities, Precar Fleet Services is an independent division of Precar Services, offering specialty fleet fit-outs for commercial applications ranging from simple tray and tow bar fitments to fully bespoke service body and accessory installation. With quality-assured safety, compliance and standardisation of vehicle builds, Precar Fleet Services are a premier all-in-one solutions provider for commercial vehicle fleet operators, leasing companies, and original equipment manufacturers. For further information on how Precar Fleet Services can assist in solving your commercial vehicle fit-out needs, please visit precar.com.au and click on the link to Fleet Services.
Modera is a cloud-based, AI-powered CRM and retail platform aimed at digitizing the physical process of selling a car. The Modera platform sits between existing automotive dealer and OEM systems, providing car dealerships a quick and easy shift to digital ways of working, all done entirely digitally and with total ease.
David, thanks very much for agreeing to talk to us today. We appreciate your time and giving us the opportunity to learn more about your company and the business you do.
Yeah, thank you.
So maybe to kick things off, can you tell us about AutoTest and how AutoTest started and what you do?
Yeah, AutoTest spawned out of a much larger engineering consultancy. In that consultancy, we were involved in a lot of the Australian design rule work, particularly in seatbelt anchorages, brakes, and windscreen areas. We worked with the government in the early 80s to develop a set of rules or modify a set of design rules, which became at that time the Australian Design Rules, or the second edition. Further down the track, we're contacted by particularly the New South Wales government to be involved in modifying what they call their safety check, or it was an annual inspection scheme that they introduced. Their particular issue at that time was there'd been 2 bus accidents that probably 40-odd people died over the 2 accidents. And they were concerned that their inspection scheme wasn't up to scratch. So they contacted us and gave us a whole series of would-be type scenarios, or would-be, could be. And we were asked to set up a framework and specify some instrumentation and a plan that might be introduced in the AIS scheme. So we did that. We wrote the rules, which became legislation. At that time, it was an imperative for that government. They had a short timeline, and it was introduced very quickly. So at that time, Vipac was the engineering consultancy that was involved. We then decided to produce that instrument for sale to the public. So further down the track within that company, AutoTest was born. So AutoTest was a trading company. It's an old company, but it was trading in that area from the early 90s probably. And then by the year 2000, we renamed the company and fenced it off, and it became a fully trading, manufacturing and design consultancy.
So were you involved in it right from that early stage? Or
Yep.
Did you join later?
From the early 80s and all the way through to now. And these days, it's we've now got 26 active products. We've moved into a lot of areas that were not where we started. Yeah.
And I see you're also a distributor for some Japanese products. Is that right?
Yes, Ono Soki is a part of the Toyo family. So if you understand the way the Japanese companies worked, or particularly the Toyo family, each of the family members had their own little conglomerate that contributed to part of the motor manufacturing industry. Ono Soki were an acoustics and vibration company, and that's my background, as acoustics and vibration. And they supply a lot of instrumentation to the automotive industry. So we've had a long relationship with Ono Soki. I worked with them in Japan for nearly 6 months, learning how they run their businesses. But Ono Soki supply a lot of instrumentation to many of the automotive manufacturers.
Are you able to tell us more about measuring equipment and the industry, the people you work with, and the regulatory bodies that you deal with, and how do you deal with them?
Yeah, we cover a range of inputs. So, for example, I was just talking about the New South Wales government. They came to us for help. We also sit on a couple of standard committees. The most recent one was the ISO 3450, which looks at braking regulations in the mining industry. The most active people in that area are the coal people, where hot brakes causes fires in the mine, so it becomes a significant safety issue. We also sit on a few European bodies. Most notably, we attend CETA every year or so. CETA is an organisation that is a direct lobby to the European Union. And they cover roadworthiness of vehicles in every domain. So for us, that's really important, membership. It gives us an insight as to where Europe is going. So if you understand the regulatory background in Australia, in the 80s, we were very involved on a world stage. Our Australian design rules have, at that time, have become part of the EN, or the European Union specifications. The really unfortunate part for Australia is we really dropped the ball from a regulatory point of view, where we no longer contribute on a world stage. So much of it has been adopted by Europe. And now that vehicle manufacturing is finished in Australia, we're basically being given what we get, as opposed to 5 years ago where we were specifying.
So is that the reason that we've dropped the ball there, is because the manufacturing was stopped in Australia?
I'm really not sure why we dropped the ball. It is very topical at the minute, that to do with emissions. Everybody is talking about emissions and how we control it. And very recently, in the government speak, they're talking about enforcing emission regulations. In 1983, the Australian government signed an agreement with the European, it was the EEC then, to enforce emission control. And since then, no government has done anything. So our current regulatory framework in that area is still the same as what it was in 1983. So it's very topical at the minute for the government to be saying we should do things. We've had 40 years of missed opportunity. But the government is in quite a predicament with the cars. The cars that are manufactured and would be imports are generally Euro 5 or Euro 6. And that's a fuel quality. And what is happening with the cars in Australia is we're putting Euro 4 or worse fuel in them. So for the manufacturers, that will become a warranty issue for them, so that the fuel is destroying their car without even discussing the emissions.
No, so I think that's going to be quite challenging. Are they looking to upgrade the quality of the fuel? Do you know what's happening in that sector?
In amongst the ANZUS agreement, the Australian government have agreed to keep 1 million barrels of oil as a stock, or as a national security stock. in case of war. More recently, they've been buying tankers of fuel that are actually physically located in the US to fulfil that agreement. But in terms of what's happening with the refineries, which is really where the Euro 5 or 6 or 4 fuel needs to come from, the refineries are all quite old, 30 years old, and there's not many of them left, 2 or 3 left. Most of those, to produce Euro 5 fuel, need to upgrade the refineries, and each one will be many billions of dollars. So they have certainly got their hand out with the government saying, we need money from you to upgrade to meet the regulation that you want to introduce. So it's quite a predicament for the Australian government, and I'm not sure how they will resolve it. My personal opinion is they'll tax fuel vehicles out of existence and go to electric. But that isn't a great solution in Australia at the minute anyway.
Because I was quite interested that they stopped manufacturing, because my understanding is the reason Holden was originally set up after the Second World War is to have automotive manufacturing as a protection in case of war. So that's why we started automotive manufacturing.
That reason and jobs, manufacturing, particularly that level of manufacturing or assembly, involves a huge number of people. So it's a very good source, and it leads into the defence industry and the allied industries that are created with automotive manufacturing are enormous. The estimate when the Melbourne assembly plants closed was 10,000 direct jobs and 150,000 indirect jobs would be lost. And of course that doesn't happen in one day, because the plastic moulding plant that's making doorknobs, that'll be one of his product range. It might be 30% of what he makes or of his sales. And so over time he will fold, because he won't be able to adapt to different industries. So the government estimates, I think, were probably not well thought through.
So, David, where does AutoTest sit in the automotive sector and the world in terms of measuring equipment?
We have this statistic at the minute. So 50 countries, 50,000 products, and 50 product lines. So that's what we would claim. We are in the instrumentation area. We are a player all across the world in 46 different countries, supplying predominantly optical or windscreen optics, decelerometers or brake meters, and emission equipment. But of course, there's a whole range of other things. We sell the Ono Soki range as well, which is more aimed at the design and homologation of the automotive industry. In Australia, we're one of 2 manufacturers, and of those 2 manufacturers for decelerometers, between the 2 manufacturers would cover 90% of the world market.
And are you dealing directly with OEMs, or are you dealing with dealers, or both?
We have a distribution network, so we do deal with the OEMs, but that's not our that's not our core business. Our core business is a distribution chain to the end user. Our end user is typically a garage or motor mechanic, but we do deal with, for example, mining companies, and they're just a bigger version of a garage. So there's different market segments for us. We deal with defence, but that's not such a large industry for us. Our main industry is the automotive, the consumer automotive industry.
And can you share which are the main countries you deal with?
Malaysia, the UK, France, Denmark, Spain would be South Africa. They'd be our largest areas of presence.
So it's quite a diverse number of countries that you're dealing with.
Yeah, well, in total, it's approximately 50. The largest single country is the UK.
And you have distributors in each of those countries working on your behalf.
Our business model outside Australia is to locate a suitable company that can deal with, or that can apply the after-sales service, which is one of the most important parts of it. So they need to be able to sell and represent, but they also need to repair and service. So we'll go out and find somebody, teach them how to maintain and repair and calibrate the products. So for us, the biggest part of all of our instrumentation is the calibration, which makes sure that it's reading correctly and it provides the right numbers, because so much of it is involved in road safety. You really want the device to be accurate and know that it's accurate. And that's why we're NATA accredited, and we push that model out all over the world. So many of our distributors are 17025 accredited.
And then how often do you have to test your equipment to make sure it is reading correctly? Is it like a once a year or every 2 years?
Once a year is typical. Some of them are 2 years. In terms of the period that we would recommend is once a year. But of course, if you drop it or damage it, that will change that as well.
And David, what makes you stand out against your competitors? What makes you different?
Our quality is what we would put, and our accreditation. So NATA is quite important to us in terms of ensuring that we provide the very best instrument that gives you the very best reading, and that is part of our model. But our model is really after-sales service. So most of these tools end up in a garage, and they rely on these instruments to earn an income. So it's important that they work, and they work properly all of the time. So the model we put forward is accuracy and after-sales service and repair.
And then in terms of that quality, if you had looking at two instruments, what would be the things you look for when you're purchasing that type of equipment?
We provide a robust instrument. So we design the instruments to be able to, or fit for purpose in a workshop. So they're able to be dropped in most instances, and they're able to be stored in adverse conditions. For example, a coal mine, they will be dust-proof and water, splash-proof. So from that sort of quality point of view, that comes into the design. From a reliability point of view, we're designing all of our instruments for a long-term life. We look at typically 10 years, and many of the instruments that we built in the early 90s are still in service and still operatable. So there's a lifetime that we like to put forward. Of course, with the lifetime, the components change over time. So these days there are better components. So we end up in having generations of the same product.
And do you refurbish products towards end of life?
We do. So we can take a product and change the internal circuitry to bring it up to scratch, so we can refurbish it that way. We also trade them in, so to take a new for old.
No, that's really interesting. It's such an important part that if you can do that at the end of life, it makes a big difference.
Yeah, we're very, very conscious of the downtime of our end users, and we try and... So, for example, many of them, when they send their unit here for repair, we have hire units we can loan them, so we can loan them a comparative instrument to get them through, and that gives them a seamless, completely seamless service time.
Because you need it for your business, you can't do without it.
Yeah.
So it's not like you can sit with 2 weeks and not use the instruments.
Especially working in a regulated market, because many of the markets are regulated by the government, so they can't operate without the equipment.
And then you mentioned that you do a lot of work in mining and heavy vehicles. Can you tell us more about that, where you operate and how you operate? So
the mining industry, it's a regulated industry, but it's regulated in a different way. So an underground vehicle in a coal mine, if the brakes are not operating correctly, they will get too hot, for example. And then they will cause a fire. So the coal dust is airborne and terribly flammable. So there are all sorts of temperature constraints within a coal mine, and they cover the brakes. So to remediate that from the operating point of view, they test the brakes weekly on every vehicle, or typically weekly. Some are 100 hours is a common criteria. And that's just to make sure that the brakes are operating correctly, won't get too hot, won't cause a fire. So rather than an accident issue in a coal mine, it's an occupational health and safety criteria. And likewise with emissions. So with diesel emissions, there are a couple of things that are predominant. One is the nitrous oxides, which are poisonous and carcinogenic. The hydrocarbon, which is essentially unburnt fuel or unburnt oil, is also carcinogenic. And of course, there's the carbon monoxide, which is poisonous also, but not carcinogenic. So they're very interested, particularly underground, in the emissions, but they're interested in controlling emissions within the mine anyway, for health and safety reasons, as opposed to greenhouse gas type interests. So very important to them. They test most of the vehicles again weekly or monthly. So quite a different outlook on that industry.
When you're testing those brakes, how do you actually test it? Because are you testing the actual brake pads? Is it quite a complex task?
No, it's not a complex task. It's a very simple task. There are 2 or 3 methods of testing brakes. So there's the old traditional method where they park the truck on a hill, and if it doesn't move, it's all working properly. In the early days, the English started doing dynamic brake, what they call dynamic brake tests. And for us, that's what we conduct. It's a whole vehicle test. So test every part of the brake system, and the vehicle's underway at a normal operating speed. So typically you drive a vehicle to 30 kilometres an hour, and then you put your foot on the brake and you measure how that responds. And there are key criteria that will indicate whether the system's functioning properly or not. Typically an average deceleration or a stopping distance. And for us, that tests every part of the brake system, the pads, the cooling, the operation, the mechanical controls, and you do it. The alternative method is what they call a roller brake tester, where the vehicle is actually stationary and they put the wheels on a set of rollers that apply a force to the wheels, and you put your foot on the brake, and once the vehicle comes to a stop or stops the rollers, they measure the force. The disadvantages of that are that the cooling system is not tested with the brakes. Friction coefficient of the tyre roller is often different to what it would be on a road, and it's typically tested at 2 kilometres an hour, so very, very slow speed, which also gives different outcomes for the actual friction material and the brake pad or the brake surface itself. But again, that's indicative. So we would tend to say that a vehicle underway with a full load, which is the other thing that a roller brake tester won't take into consideration, is the load, which is really, the basic principle. Force is equal to mass times acceleration. So if the mass is wrong, then the force is wrong. And the roller brake test system won't take that into account. So our method is underway, and we think it's a better method. It's more realistic. It represents what's going on a lot better and tests according to that.
And David, is there any type of pre-warning, like on those brakes? Can you install something that would start to alert you, saying, well, we think there might be something wrong here, like oil's low or whatever, and then you could say, well, we better bring it up for a test?
The key parts of a brake system, or the friction material and the response material. In other words, typically a brake system will be a brake pad and a disc. Well, sometimes it's a drum. The thing that wears is the disc and the brake and the friction material, the pad. And there are indicative things to look for if you want to pull it apart. The idea of doing these dynamic tests is to set a criteria, and the criteria will obviously have a safety factor into it. And once you get below that, you need to service your brakes. And the most likely spot to look will be the friction material. If you track a vehicle over time with its performance, you will find that it gradually degrades. So it is a very good method of setting a criteria, and once you get to that, you change it. Many of the mines muck around with the criteria because they're a lot more focused than the average consumer on maintenance costs. So they'll be trying to balance off the maintenance cost versus the safety level. We have software to model braking performance. So many of the mines use this software. They test a truck repeatedly at typically weekly, fortnightly intervals, and we have a database, what we call reliability software, that will map it so you can actually plot the performance of the truck over time. So a lot of the mines, particularly the larger mining companies, are using that over a whole fleet, and they're in fact gathering more data or more reliability data than anybody else. So they've got a very good handle on how their trucks perform.
David, thanks very much for sharing some very interesting information with us today, because a lot of the things we take for granted, spend a lot of time in automotive, but it's very fascinating to see the things you go through, especially in the mining and heavy truck industry, to maintain those standards and make sure everything's in place from a safety point of view. So thanks very much for joining us on the show today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the interview with AutoTest as much as I did. It's a fascinating part of the automotive industry, and it's amazing all the things they're doing and what happens in the background that we don't always know about. If you enjoyed what you heard, subscribe to our channel below. You can also find us on iTunes and Spotify, and we also have our own website, autocurrents.com.